Hello, hello, hello out there. Um, Not sure who's going to see this. We wanted to experiment with going live and trying to share some thoughts a bit more spontaneously. In particular, today we wanted to touch on the topic of hearing from God by way of dreams and visions. All throughout the Bible, we have example after example of God speaking to individuals, particularly through dreams and visions. I mean, obviously, you have the case of Moses, where it seems that he was able to speak to God face to face in person, and that's quite extraordinary in the Old Testament. But more often than not, we see God speaking to individuals by way of dreams and by way of visions. There's the example of the dream that Joseph had way back in the book of Genesis, where he saw the vision of the plants. And there's another dream in the Old Testament that's very, very significant in the book of Daniel, including where he interprets a dream for a great king. There's a dream that Ezekiel has in the book after his name. There's the dream that Joseph in the New Testament had, where Jesus is about to be born, and God is telling Joseph by way of a dream to go to Egypt. And so he warns Joseph, and that helps to make sure that Jesus is cared for. And then there's also the example in the same book in the Gospels, where the wise men are warned by way of a dream to not return back to Herod to inform Herod about where Jesus was born. And so you have various examples in the New Testament of God speaking to individuals through dreams. The real question is, does he still do so today? Is he still speaking to people by way of dreams? And if so, what should that mean for us in our spiritual walk? So that's a very important question. I think a lot of people today take more of a hardline stance towards hearing from God in general. And there are a lot of individuals that tend to feel that if God is going to speak, he's only going to do so through the Bible. But the Bible itself doesn't actually say that. In fact, in the Bible, it talks about in the last days, young men seeing visions, old men dreaming dreams. This concept of him still being alive and speaking. And let me just put a disclaimer. If I get any of these verses not exactly right word for word, you just have to bear with me. I don't have the Bible here to reference at the moment. I'm just kind of speaking off the cuff to try to explore a few of the concepts with you that relate to hearing from God in the modern world. We live in a time where there's just so much deception, and there's so many half truths that are being spread, for example, through AI, through artificial intelligence, which is a imitation of the kind of real intelligence that God gives to his creation, right? And so in a day and age like we have today, it's so easy for us to be deceived about what is right, what is wrong, what is the voice of God, and what is not the voice of God. And so it's really helpful to be able to discern, is this actually God speaking to me? Is this actually the voice of God that I'm hearing, or am I hearing some other voice? Right. And so we recently produced a video just yesterday. In fact, we released it, that in a very succinct way goes into a bit of detail about how to hear from God, especially when he speaks through dreams, especially when he speaks through visions. So we want to encourage you to check it out. In a nutshell, we talk about some of the other ways to hear from God, which are also quite relevant. We talk in a series actually that we've done on this channel. We start with listening to our conscience. So our conscience is something that each of us has, that tells us right from wrong, whether or not we're even getting close to doing something wrong. And it's so important, so critical that we listen to that voice of conscience if we're going to be able to make the right decisions, right, in our spiritual walk. We also talk about the words of Jesus, his actual teachings, the actual teachings of Jesus, and how significant they are for us to be able to actually hear from God. Jesus said in Matthew 7, he talks about his words and obedience to his words being the dividing factor between someone who builds their house on the rock, right, and someone who builds their house on sand. And he says that when you hear his words and you do them, you're like someone who builds their house upon a rock, so that when the storms of this life come and they knock upon that house, it stands firm. Whereas when we hear his words and we don't actually obey, it's like building our house on sand, right? And so the importance of listening to Jesus, the importance of following our conscience, and the importance of godly counsel, that's another important way to actually hear from God, and that can include obviously people that are living today. If we find them living a godly life, it can be helpful to get their advice, to hear their opinion, but also, people who help to write the Bible. So whether it's the Apostle Paul, whether it's, the Apostle James, so many of these godly men that actually were ordained by the Lord, and they have such great counsel that you can find in the Bible. And so when we're trying to interpret a dream or a vision, it doesn't hurt to weigh it up. Like, how does this compare with, for example, what Paul said on the similar subject? Or how does this compare with what's written in other passages in the Bible, to get the full counsel of God before we make a decision, right? So all of those are very helpful and very useful in terms of actually discerning God's will. Now, having said all that, I think the challenging part that we find as believers, I know that I find it, and I think others struggle with too, is to really apply what we hear from God, to really be able to make it practical in our lives. We have to be willing to let go of our own will, right? So there's a saying that we need to be willing to hear what we don't want to hear, and that requires us to not be so fixed on what we want, on our own desire, on our own will. We have to be willing to release that. And I know for me, that's been a concept that revolutionized my life. For those who don't know, a little bit of my testimony, I gave my life to the Lord over 20 years ago. I had some scholarships, mainly for basketball, when I was 18, and I was living in Los Angeles. And, I was on a path for what you might consider material success, but I wasn't happy. I didn't have peace. I wasn't fulfilled. I had a lot of anxieties. I wasn't certain that even if I died, like, how do I know that I'm going to heaven? Because if I am, I should see the fruits in my life. I should have the peace of God working in my life. I should have those things, but I was missing something. And that's when I was introduced to what Jesus actually taught. And I started to read the Gospels for myself. And I started to see, wow, Jesus said all these amazing radical things that, the churches that I've been going to, the churches I'm familiar with, they don't actually speak about. Right? Jesus said things like, whoever doesn't forsake all that he has can't be my disciple. I never heard that preached in any church, right? Or he said things like, you can't serve God and mammon, right? In Matthew 6, verse 24, you can't serve God and mammon. That is an amazing teaching, but I never heard any church preach that. I remember when I was a child, I used to listen to TBN, Trinity Broadcasting Network, and I would often follow pastors like, for example, Creflo Dollar. And I just recall that nearly every time I'd hear him preach, he was saying, open your Bible to the book of Proverbs, right? Open your Bible to the book of Malachi. Very rarely was he saying, open your Bible to the book of Matthew so we can hear the actual words of Jesus, right? Or open your Bible even to the book of Revelation, which is Jesus still speaking by way of revelation to the prophet John, right? So it started to make sense to me that, wait a minute. Maybe this version of Christianity that I've been, taught since birth is not really the way that it's supposed to be done. Maybe somehow we've deviated from the true course that God intended, and we need to get back to that way, which is Jesus, and not just him as a person, but what he actually taught, right? And so fast forward 20 years, I've had a great opportunity to live overseas with many believers. I've had an opportunity to explore, different parts of the world and to try to preach the gospel to people that I never would have imagined I'd even have a chance to meet. And so I've been very blessed in that regard. I'm still trying to discover new ways that God speaks. I'm still trying to make sure that I'm walking in his will for the present, right? And that's one of the reasons that I want to really, more than preach at people, I want to kind of preach with you, in a sense, in terms of like, let's explore these issues together. Let's really talk about, how do we hear from God, right? So if none of us except Jesus has a perfect understanding of God's will, we're all kind of in this struggle together. We're all trying to find God's will. I don't know that any one of us is up here and everyone is down there in terms of our own spiritual walk, but it's more like, what can we do to encourage each other to walk more in the will of God, right? And so that's where a series like this kind of come in terms of, how do we hear from God? Because it's so hard to actually follow God if we can't first hear from him, right? And so one of the most important things that I feel we need to get right as believers is actually listening to and discerning the voice of God. All right, so this live stream, again, because we did it a bit spontaneously, we felt a bit inspired to give it a try. We didn't want it to go too long. We wanted to keep it a bit short. If you do have any questions or comments, feel free to let us know, like, what are your thoughts on the concept of hearing from God? How does God speak today, right? What are some of the ways that you feel that you've personally experienced hearing the voice of God? Or do you feel like you've never heard God speak? Like, do you feel that he's done speaking, or that the only way he speaks is through the pages of the Bible? I'm curious to hear what you think. This is not so much a lecture as it is something that we're trying to explore together, right? To better understand what God is saying in the modern world. So thank you so much for checking out this live stream. Hopefully we'll get better at it as we continue, if we decide to do more of them. But yeah, definitely do leave a comment, or feel free to send us an email if you prefer more personal communication. But most importantly, keep seeking God in your own life. You know, it says to seek God, and he's there, right? If we cry out to him with our whole heart, he's listening. He's a very present help in the time of need, and all we have to do is turn to him, right? It's the verse I love in Revelation. I think it says Jesus is standing at the door. He's knocking, right? And he wants us to let him in. So we really need to just be open to the Spirit and be willing to follow God, even if it changes our own plans, even if it changes our own will, even if it causes us to go away from what we previously held to, right? So those are important thoughts for us to consider. Thanks again for watching, and God bless.